Phoena's Quest, Book 1, First Spark, by Chrissy Garwood. Chapter 10, Talking Their Way Out. Carillion coughed. If the two of you have finished your game, I have an answer to Phoena's question. He reached for her hand. Carillion drew her closer to the smouldering fire. There is no doubt that while we are in contact, you can transport us with you. But as soon as the portal opens to your destination, your defensive wards throw us away. They separate us to minimise our threat to you. Come, sit here and lean against me, Carillion continued. She hesitated, glancing to the others. Barapa and Aramis, take your place on either side of Our Lady. I'm sure, now that she has accepted us as her companions, she will be able to sit beside us without fear. Perhaps now the wards won't see us as a threat. Phoena sat, with her knees bent and her feet flat on the ground in front of her. She wrapped her arms around her legs, gazing into the dying flames. Aramis rested his back against her knees. He was still very hot. Carillion reclined behind her. She could feel his breath on her neck as his hand played with her curls. Barapa stared into the darkness behind them. How long do you think we have been in these caves? Carillion stirred. That depends on whether time became involved with the transport. My stomach tells me I've missed luncheon, and it must be close to dinner now. Do you think Lord Westonbrook is still waiting? Where are you going with these questions? If her magic works the way you expect, Barapa said, then what I describe will have an impact. Would it be better for me to describe in detail the reception room where we met with Lord Westonbrook? Aramis turned. Imagine the furor if we materialised in Barapa's family home. What makes you think we'll go anywhere? Phoena asked. Barapa dropped down beside Phoena and lifted one of her hands. She adjusted her position. You said you didn't want to try this experiment if we weren't together, and Carillion has been careful in telling us where to sit. I think you both suspect this is our chance to get out of these caverns. We could go anywhere or nowhere, Carillion told him. I want to test whether the words Phoena hears influence her power. That's why I suggested you talk about your name day feast. If we arrive at your family home, Barapa, then we'll have an answer. She's never been there. But if my guess is correct, she will take us out of this tomb back to the academy. She sighed. Aramis turned towards her, and Barapa squeezed her hand. Phoena looked at her feet. She didn't want them to know her disappointment. If they returned to the academy, the closeness between them would be no more. But it wasn't fair to keep them underground for a moment longer. Carillion leaned forward to speak in her ear. I'm leaving it to you to make the right choice. I trust Barapa's logic to guide you. One thing you should consider is whether you want answers. Lord Westonbrook must have had something important to discuss with you. We should get started then, Phoena said. Before I talk about my name day feast, Barapa said, let me tell you a tale from my childhood to warm up my voice. My old nurse said it was my mother's favourite story when she was a child. A long time ago, in a faraway land, there lived a handsome prince. They're always the best kind of story, Aramis told Phoena. But I always wonder what happens to all the ugly princes. Let him tell his story. I'm hoping for a happy ever after ending. Thank you, Phoena, Barapa said, smiling up at her. The handsome prince lived a lonely life in a faraway land. He was young and wanted to see the world. The prince longed for adventures, but he knew his duty was to his people. His parents were the reigning king and queen. They were old, and he had no brothers and sisters. So he spent his days doing princely things, growing weary while he waited for something interesting to happen. He had few friends. One by one, the few he had left him to go out into the world and seek their fortune. The news came back that each had found their perfect bride and would never return. He dutifully sent them his best wishes and the obligatory gift. I always wonder what kind of gift a prince sends to a friend after they abandon him, Carillion said. Would he resist the temptation to send a transport spell that dragged his friends home? With or without the bride? Aramis asked. The gift doesn't matter, Barappa said. It's the prince's story that's important. There was an ancient prophecy that foretold the downfall of his kingdom. He must marry a true princess before he ascended to the throne. The years passed. The elderly king grew weaker and weaker. The people began to ask if the lonely prince would find a true princess before it was too late. Phoena wants a happy ending, Carillion reminded him. Your poor prince seems destined for a dismal end. That's what everyone thought, Barappa said. At first the people were content to whisper about the prince's situation. But soon they were discussing his lack of a bride in the marketplace. There were questions asked about his suitability as a monarch, if he were so unlucky in love. Just because he couldn't find a true princess doesn't mean he was unlucky in love. Carillion tugged Phoena's hair. Everyone knows that princes are free to take liberties with all the maidens in the land. She slapped his hand. Not this prince. If the prophecy insists on a true princess, then he has to prove himself true or she won't have him. Well said, laughed Aramis. Carillion, she's heard of your reputation and given you notice to behave. Barappa waited until they resumed their silence. The lonely prince decided to take action. He went to his parents and told them that he must leave in search of the true princess. The queen asked him to delay his departure. She told him that if a true princess did not arrive within a year and a day, he would be free to journey in search of her. He paused. Get on with the story, Aramis said. I was waiting for one of you to interrupt me again. You haven't, so I'll have to do it myself. What's with the phrase a year and a day? Barappa asked. That sets up the expectation that the true princess will only turn up at the end. Surely a year is long enough to wait. Why add that extra day? Aramis should answer that question, Carillion said. Have you considered his sudden appearance at the academy in our final year? Perhaps he had to leave home to seek a bride. That makes no sense, Aramis said. If I was seeking a princess, why would I enrol in an all-male academy? Carillion and Barappa nodded towards Phoena. She shook her head in disbelief, her cheeks glowing. Please continue the story, Barappa. There are no princesses at the academy. The lonely prince had better search elsewhere for his happiness. Barappa chuckled. The days passed until one day remained until the prince was freed from his promise. That morning the sky was overcast. By midday a terrible storm had descended on the land. There had never been a storm like it in all the history of the land. A few hours later, a knock came at the castle door. The prince was passing and welcomed a caravan of wet strangers into the courtyard. The small party included a very bedraggled... Bedraggled? Carillion cried. That's a strange word. It always makes me envision the princess dressed in rags and ready for bed. Of course, the prince would be a proper gentleman and pretend he didn't notice her bed readiness. Baraba coughed. Soaked by the storm, the maiden was in a terrible state. Her uncle, who was her guardian, begged the prince to offer them hospitality. He told the prince that his niece was a princess on her way to a distant kingdom to consider an offer of marriage. The prince was immediately interested and ran off to tell his mother, "A princess has come!" The queen urged him to be cautious. Not everyone who claims to be a princess, or not to be a princess, laughed Carillion. Ignore him, Phoena said. Baraba patted her hand. I'm almost finished. The prince was impatient, but he knew better than to go against his mother's wishes. Wise man, muttered Carillion. Have either of you met my mother? If she knew about half the mischief I get up to at the academy, she'd curtail my freedom. Phoena sighed. Baraba smiled. The queen welcomed the travellers. She escorted the princess to a special bedchamber. Aha! Cried Carillion. The queen took one look at the bedraggled princess. Phoena shushed him. If you interrupt one more time, I'll... Carillion mimed, sewing his lips closed. Baraba spat out the next words at a faster pace. The special bedchamber had a single bed made up of layers of thick mattresses. The pile rose so high that the princess had to climb a step-ladder to get into bed. The queen left the princess alone. The next morning she returned to ask the princess how she had slept. The princess said the bed was terrible. There was something hard and lumpy under the mattress. The queen had the servants take away all the mattresses, and right on the bottom was a tiny pebble. It was a pea! Exclaimed Carillion, and then covered his mouth. His eyes were laughing. On the bottom was a tiny pebble. Only a true princess would be able to feel such a tiny pebble under all those mattresses, the queen said. She told the prince to marry the princess. And they all lived happily ever after, declared Carillion. Now you've finished your fairy tale. Get on with talking about the food. I'm starving. Dear listening reader, I hope you have enjoyed this latest chapter from the first book in the Phoena's Quest trilogy. This is a beta copy, and the text may change between now and the official publication date. If you have any questions or suggestions that would make this chapter easier to read, please let me know. In return for your help, I will include your name in the acknowledgements as part of the reader team. Chrissy.